From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are with us tonight. We are talking about something that affects so many people, housing. Whether it is home ownership or renting, there are a lot of issues to discuss when it comes to housing. And tonight we have with us someone from the Legal Aid Society, an attorney who can help answer your questions, concerns, that kind of thing. A whole host of issues. And when I say he's here with us, I mean that literally, because he's right here. He's not on Zoom. So Zac Oswald, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you're with Legal Aid Society. You're an attorney. And this is such a huge issue, such a huge topic. I'd like you to help us narrow it down. What are some of the things, when we talk about housing, that you see there at your office?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the rental side, what we see a lot of times is people calling us, asking what their rights are. They've seen that their rent has increased and they want to know if it's legal or if there's a certain cap on how much the rent can go up. They call us because they're being evicted and they want to exercise their rights or have somebody to defend them in court. They're calling us because they're worried about the conditions in their unit and they want to have things fixed. Or they've been treated differently and they want to know what their rights are under the Fair Housing Act. And just if somebody's disabled in housing, they actually have rights to change either the rules or the structure of the policy sometimes to make sure they have equal use or enjoyment of their property. On the home ownership side, people are calling us when they're in the middle of a foreclosure process. They've gotten behind on their housing payments and they want to know, how can I keep my home? Or the bank has said, we're going to go ahead and sell your house. How can I stop that from happening? How can I fix this? How can I catch up? Because the home is the most important thing to me.
Wow. Okay. Every one of those I'm interested in. As far as a cap on rent increases. So you get calls from people who say the landlord's raising my rent. I think it's way too high. What questions do you ask? Is there a cap, or can landlords raise it to whatever?
So the initial rule is that there is no cap on how much rent can increase in Tennessee. There's actually a law specifically prohibiting rent control. So even local cities like Nashville can't require that rent only goes up by a certain percentage a month. However, there are rules. If you have a lease in place, for instance, from January to the next December, your landlord is not allowed to increase the rent during that period of time. They have to wait until the lease expires and then start a new lease at the raised amount.
So if someone calls with that question, that's what you're going to ask. You're going to ask something about the lease. You're going to say, are you under lease? And they may say, well, the lease is ending and they want me to sign another lease and they're raising my rent by $500. And you would say, well, they can do that.
I would say that they can probably do that.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting. And I mean, we're going to talk more about just how rents have gone up in Nashville. It's absolutely astounding.
Absolutely.
Absolutely astounding. Okay, conditions. Conditions of rental properties, I would think that's one of the areas you get the most calls. Is that right or not?
That's right. And with the conditions, it's trying to explain to people what their rights are and allowing them to decide, here is what I can do as the tenant in terms of enforcing my rights. Is it worth me staying here and making my landlord mad that I enforce those rights, or should I find another place? The basics are that the landlord has a responsibility to keep the place clean and habitable, fit and safe, and to follow all building and health codes. And if those things aren't happening, then the tenant has the right to request that the landlord makes repairs or upgrades to get to that basic standard of living.
And do you see, all right, how many battles are there over those kind of things?
I think we see just a ton of battles over there, and it's a myriad. Sometimes it's the tenant maybe is being a little bit picky that instead of having a single pane window, they want to have a double pane window. But sometimes it's a landlord who maybe lives out of state and doesn't even realize what the condition of the property is. And so the tenant has to find a way to document that, get that to the landlord so that those repairs can be made.
The other one you mentioned is treated differently. And explain that.
So we have in this country and in Tennessee, we have the Fair Housing Act and the Tennessee Human Rights Act, and those require that you are not treated differently based on your representation in a protected class. That means can't be treated differently because of your race, your color, your national origin, your religion, your sex, or even your familial status, your family having children in it, or you're handicapped. And so we see that there are some instances where somebody is in a predominantly white neighborhood, and they're a black family and they want to move in, and they're blocked from moving into that housing. Well, that's being treated differently because of the color of your skin, and you have rights to enforce that so that you can get into housing just like anybody else in that area.
So if you got that call, what would your first question be? How would you go about proving that? Because yeah, that's terrible, it's unacceptable. How do you prove it? You know, how do you get at that?
That's a really good question. It varies depending on, do we have a written statement from the landlord? Obviously, that's the easiest case. I'll take it and be done with it by the end of the next week.
In other words, saying because of your race or religious affiliation or gender or whatever, I'm not going to rent to you.
Correct.
So that would be a pretty dumb thing for the landlord.
That would be a really dumb thing for the landlord
but it would help.
to say. It helps, and it's happened.
It's happened.
It's happened.
Okay, that's interesting.
So we see it sometimes with advertisements where it's written in there. There's a specification that we're looking for a certain type of tenant, and you can tell by the description what type of tenant that they're looking for.
Really?
Yes.
Now, would that apply? And I'm just getting interested here. Would that apply? Let's say you're a female and you want a female roommate, and you say, I just want a female roommate. That it wouldn't apply there, right?
No, there are exceptions to the type of housing, to who's living there, particularly if they're going to be occupying it jointly, that you can make preferences at that point. Of course, we want everyone to be able to feel safe in their housing. If they're renting out another room, that's a different story. So
would you say you're seeing more cases when it comes to rental, or less, or about the same? Let's like the last 5 years or so. What have you seen?
Well, we've seen about the same level of cases from 5 years ago to now. With the major difference that we've seen is obviously with the COVID eviction moratorium. Cases stopped going to court for evictions for a while. So we saw that happen. It stopped what we were looking at, and then all of a sudden cases started coming back in a fury. We found that there were some rent relief programs that we're going to talk about tonight that were able to help tenants, and now the normal level of cases is about to where we were 5 years ago.
Can you, at the legal aid, can you handle that? Do you have enough attorneys to deal with that volume?
We at Legal Aid would always be willing to have more resources to be able to help people. The statistics in court right now is that about 80 to 90% of landlords are represented when they go to court, and the inverse of that, tenants are represented about 5 to 10% of the time. And because tenants are struggling, or they're on the lower income spectrum from a business owner, a landlord, or something like that, it's really difficult for them to be able to hire attorneys. And so Legal Aid is very often the only resource that's available to be able to represent tenants.
And so if somebody is out there tonight and they call, what's the process? How likely are they to talk to an attorney? What would it take for you to take their case? How does that all work?
So people will call in. Legal Aid Society is partially funded by the federal government, so we have income restrictions. We're only allowed to help people that are in low income, people that are 60 or over, or people that are victims of domestic violence. So we would first do an intake to make sure that they qualify for our services. They would talk to a paralegal to ask what is going on with their situation, and then an attorney would review their case. And we do everything from representing people in court, providing them with forms that might be able to let them represent themselves in court, or just providing them with an advice letter that says, unfortunately, we don't have enough attorneys to represent you, but what we can do is tell you how to represent yourself, tell you what your rights are in this situation, and hope that we can get you on your feet and help it where you can represent yourself as well.
All right, so this is an opportunity for people to call in with a question they may have, a concern they may have, a chance to talk with Zac from Legal Aid, an attorney here. There's a caller on line 1, and I missed the name. What is the name? It's Kenny. Tiffany. Tiffany. Hello, Tiffany. Go right ahead with your question.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for taking my call. I had a question in regards to renters' rights in regards to the apartment and heating.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead.
Okay, and actually, the month of November, I reported to my landlord there was mold in my HVAC unit, which caused me to not be able to use it. And it actually went unrepaired for about 3 months. And I received a rent increase letter as soon as it was repaired in February. However, I have spent out-of-pocket costs for hotels and shelter because it was really cold, as well as my lupus was affected by the mold as well as the lack of heat. and I was wondering how to proceed forward because no one will speak to me from the apartment. They referred me to an attorney on their behalf.
Wow. All right, so let me get this straight. So you live in an apartment. You were living in an apartment. Did you have
I'm currently still here.
And you're still there. Did you have a lease? Did you have a lease?
I do.
And it was a 1-year lease?
Uh-huh.
And you said that there was a problem with mold in your HVAC. You couldn't use it. They did finally fix it after 3 months, but then they raised your rent. Is that right?
Absolutely. They had about 4 companies come out and tell them it would be better to replace it as opposed to repair it. And it was just neglected. And then I was brought a space heater about 2 weeks in and told that would pretty much suffice.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Do you have any questions? Sorry.
No, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm happy to kind of take a brief approach at it. Obviously not going to be able to solve all of those issues at once, but when we're talking about heating in particular in winter, there are a list of essential services that the landlord is required to provide. That's heating, gas, electricity, and water. And any of those that if they're the landlord's responsibility to take care of and they don't take care of those, either because they intentionally shut them off or they negligently shut them off, then the tenant has a right to write to the landlord, tell them these are the things that are messed up, and then choose one of 3 options. One is to continue to live there and make the repairs themselves and deduct the amount of those repairs. Number 2 is to live elsewhere, like she mentioned, living in a hotel, and stop paying rent during that time, or continue to live in the property with the conditions as they are and eventually file a lawsuit against the landlord for the offset of what the property value would have been like. If my rent is normally $1,000 a month, but I lived there with no heat during November and December, maybe the value of that property is really $500 a month instead of $1,000 a month. The difficulty here is, one, proving that there was mold in the HVAC unit. We're not sure if any of those contractors are going to come back and say that. Probably not, because they want to keep working with this landlord in the future. Or if she had an independent contractor come out who could come and testify to that in court. And then the second is, how are we going to value what the difference in that property is? We've got to find somebody who's, as an expert, who's willing to come in and say, if you're paying $1,000 a month for an apartment in Nashville, but all of a sudden you don't have heat, what's the difference of that, particularly given how devastating and brutal this winter has been?
Yeah, that's right. And mold, is that something you hear a lot of? And what are the rules with mold?
Mold is tricky, and I would honestly, anybody who's got questions about mold, I would direct them to the Department of Health's Healthy Homes website. I think it's Healthy Homes TN, and check that, because mold is not really the issue itself when we see these cases, right? Mold is just a symptom of water intrusion somewhere, or improper fitting of walls and things like that. Mold is not the problem. Mold is the symptom of something else that needs to be fixed. A leaky pipe, a broken pipe, or poor housekeeping and poor conditions. And so there's a lot to that when people call us about mold, is actually digging in and seeing, now we know mold is the problem, what is the actual impetus for what got us here.
And is there, and then I'm going to go and we'll take more calls and go to break, but is there a law about mold? Obviously there's a law about heating and water and some of those. Is there one about mold? Not
specifically. We're going to be back to the landlord's responsibility is to keep a clean and safe apartment and to make sure that it's fit and habitable.
Okay, interesting. All right. Tiffany, thank you. Thank you very much for that call. We have Edward and we have another person on the line, so hold on. And if you want to call in, there's several lines open. There is the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.